Robert stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, watching tiny cars move like ants 40 stories below. His reflection stared back at him, a man who had everything money could buy, yet felt emptier with each passing day. At 52, he owned tech companies across 3 continents, but his greatest treasure wasn't in any bank account. It was his 16-year-old son, David. David had cerebral palsy. The doctors had explained it all when David was just a baby. How his muscles would be tight, how walking would be difficult, how he'd need a wheelchair for longer distances. Robert had listened to every word, but what he heard was different. He heard that his son would need protection from a world that wouldn't understand him. From that day forward, Robert made it his mission to build the perfect life for David. Money was no object. The best doctors flew in from Switzerland. Physical. Therapists came to their mansion daily. Private tutors taught David at home because Robert couldn't bear the thought of other children staring or being cruel. David had everything, except friends his own age. Their home was like a beautiful prison. Every room was designed for David's needs. Ramps replaced stairs. The swimming pool had special lifts. The garden had smooth pathways perfect for wheelchairs. It was paradise, but it was lonely paradise. David spent most days in his room, reading books or watching movies. He was incredibly smart, much smarter than Robert had been at that age. But David rarely smiled anymore. When he did, it seemed forced, like he was trying to make his father feel better. Robert told himself he was being a good father. He was protecting David from a harsh world. He was giving him opportunities other disabled children could only dream of. But deep down, a voice whispered that something was wrong. David was fading away, becoming quieter each month. The breaking point came during David's last doctor's appointment. Dr. Peterson, David's physical therapist for the past 3 years, had watched David during their session with growing concern. "Robert, we need to talk," Dr. Peterson said after David left the room. "David's physical condition is actually improving. His strength is better than ever. But I'm worried about something else." Robert felt his stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" "He's isolating himself. I've seen this before. When children with disabilities are kept too separate from their peers, they start to believe they don't belong anywhere. David barely speaks during our sessions anymore. He used to ask questions, make jokes, now he just follows instructions." Robert felt defensive. He's safe here. He has everything he needs. The best education, the best care, but he doesn't have friends. Dr. Peterson interrupted gently. He doesn't have the chance to be a normal teenager. Robert, I know you want to protect him, but you might be protecting him from the very experiences that would help him grow. That night, Robert sat in his study, staring at photos of David as a little boy. In the early pictures, David's eyes sparkled with curiosity and joy. In recent photos, that spark was dimming. Robert had built walls to keep the world out, but he was starting to realize he might have built a cage instead. Dr. Peterson had suggested something that terrified Robert. There's a community center across town that has programs for teenagers. They have a fundraising gala next month. It's not fancy, but it might be good for David to see other kids his age having fun, to feel like he's part of something bigger. Robert had dismissed the idea immediately. A community center? His son didn't belong in some rundown building with families who couldn't afford proper care. David needed specialized attention, not charity events. But as the days passed, Robert couldn't shake the image of David sitting alone in his room, staring out the window. What was he looking at? What was he thinking about? Robert realized he didn't really know his son anymore. He knew David's medical history, his therapy schedule, his academic progress. But he didn't know David's dreams, his fears, his hopes. One evening, Robert found David in the library, not reading but just sitting in his wheelchair looking at the empty shelves. The room was beautiful. Mahogany wood, leather chairs, expensive artwork. But it felt cold and lifeless. "David," Robert said softly, "would you like to go somewhere different this weekend?" David looked up, surprised. They rarely went anywhere, together except to medical appointments. "Where?" Robert hesitated. The words felt strange in his mouth. There's an event at a community center. A dance, I think. Would you be interested? For the first time in months, David's eyes showed a flicker of interest. A dance with other kids? Yes, Robert said, already regretting the decision. With other kids. David was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. I'd like that. That night, Robert lay awake, worrying. What if the other kids stared at David? What if they were cruel? What if David got hurt physically or emotionally? Robert had spent 16 years building a safe world for his son. Now he was about to expose him to all the dangers he'd worked so hard to avoid. But then he remembered David's face when he'd mentioned the dance. It was the first time in months that David had looked truly interested in anything. Maybe Dr. Peterson was right. Maybe safety wasn't the same thing as happiness. The next morning, Robert called his assistant. Cancel my meetings for Saturday night, he said. I'm taking my son to a dance. His assistant was confused. A dance, sir? Should I arrange for catering? A venue? No, Robert said, still not quite believing what he was doing. We're going to a community center, and we're going as guests, not hosts. As Saturday approached, Robert's anxiety grew. He considered canceling a dozen times. But each time he thought about backing out, he saw David's excited face. His son had been asking about the dance all week. What should he wear? What kind of music would they play? Would there be other teenagers there? Robert had forgotten what it was like to see David excited about something. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. The morning of the dance, Robert stood in front of his closet, unsure what to wear. He usually wore expensive suits to social events, but this wasn't his usual crowd. He finally chose simple slacks and a button-down shirt, feeling strangely nervous. David was ready early, wearing his favorite sweater and looking more animated than Robert had seen him in years. As they drove across town, leaving their wealthy neighborhood behind, Robert wondered if he was making the biggest mistake of his life. The community center was nothing like the places Robert usually visited. The building was old but well-maintained, with cheerful decorations and the sound of laughter spilling out into the parking lot. Robert parked the car and looked at the entrance, feeling like he was about to step into a different world. Ready? He asked David. David nodded, his eyes bright with anticipation. Ready. As they approached the door, Robert realized this wasn't just David's first real social event in years. It was his own first step into a world where his money couldn't buy his way out of uncertainty. Tonight, they would both discover what lay beyond the beautiful walls Robert had built around their lives. The moment Robert and David walked through the community center doors, Robert knew he had made a mistake. The place was nothing like the fancy charity events he usually attended. Paper decorations hung from the ceiling, and the music came from a simple speaker system instead of a live orchestra. Families sat at round tables covered with plastic tablecloths, laughing and talking loudly. Robert felt completely out of place. His simple outfit, which had seemed appropriate at home, now felt too expensive. Even trying to dress down, he still looked like he didn't belong here. Several people glanced at them curiously, and Robert's instinct was to turn around and leave, immediately. But then he looked at David, who was taking everything in with wide, interested eyes. His son was watching the other teenagers who were already dancing, some awkwardly, some confidently. For the first time in months, David looked truly alert and engaged. It's different from what I expected, David said quietly, but he didn't sound disappointed. If anything, he seemed fascinated. A woman approached them with a warm smile. Welcome. I'm Linda, one of the organizers. We're so glad you could join us tonight. Are you new to our community? Robert hesitated. How could he explain that they lived 20 minutes away but might as well have been from another planet? Yes, we're visiting, he said finally. Linda showed them to a table near the edge of the dance floor. As they sat down, Robert immediately pulled out his phone, checking emails and messages. This was his comfort zone: work, deals, problems he could solve with money and influence. The community center felt too unpredictable, too real. David, meanwhile, was watching everything with quiet fascination. A group of teenagers near their age had gathered around the snack table, joking and laughing. Some were dancing in the center of the room, not caring if they looked silly. The whole scene was so different from their quiet, controlled life at home. Robert was halfway through an important email when someone appeared beside their table. He looked up to see a young black woman in a server's uniform, holding a tray of drinks and snacks. "Hi there," she said with a genuine smile, speaking directly to David. "I'm Keisha. I'm helping serve tonight. Would you like something to drink? We have punch, soda, water." Robert immediately went into protective mode. "He's fine," he said curtly, not looking up from his phone. "We don't need anything." But David spoke up, surprising his father. "Actually, I'd like some punch, please." Keisha's smile widened as she poured David a cup of punch. "Great choice, it's my daughter's favorite too. She helped make it earlier." She glanced around the room. "Is this your first time here?" "Yes," David said. "I don't get out much." Robert shot his son a look, uncomfortable with David sharing personal information with a stranger. But Keisha didn't seem to find anything unusual about David's comment. "Well, you picked a good night," she said. "The DJ is actually pretty good for a volunteer. And the dancing gets better as the evening goes on. People stop worrying about looking perfect and just start having fun." As Keisha moved on to other tables, Robert felt irritated. Why was this stranger talking to his son like she knew him? David was vulnerable, trusting. People might take advantage of his kindness. But David was watching Keisha as she worked, noticing how she treated everyone with the same warmth and respect. She joked with the elderly volunteers, helped a little girl reach the snack table, and encouraged the shy teenagers to join the dancing. "She seems nice," David said to his father. Robert grunted, focused on his phone again. He was trying to close a business deal via text, the familiar world of negotiations and profit margins providing escape from the uncomfortable social situation. Throughout the evening, Keisha kept checking on them. She brought David cookies when she noticed he was watching the dessert table, offered to help when his wheelchair got stuck on an uneven floor tile, and always took time to chat with him like he was any other teenager. Robert found her attention annoying. He was used to people who wanted something from him. His money, his influence, his connections. What did this woman want? Why was she being so nice to David? As the evening progressed, the dancing became more enthusiastic. David watched intently as teenagers his age laughed, stumbled, and spun around the dance floor. Some were good dancers. Others were terrible, but everyone seemed to be having genuine fun. "Dad," David said quietly, "they don't look like the dancers in the movies you show me." Robert glanced up from his phone. "What do you mean?" "They're not perfect, but they look happy." Robert followed his son's gaze to the dance floor. David was right. These weren't professional dancers or wealthy kids with expensive lessons. They were just normal teenagers, some clumsy, some confident, all enjoying themselves without worrying about being judged. The music changed to a slower song, and Robert expected the dance floor to clear. Instead, more people joined in, parents dancing with their children, elderly couples swaying gently, teenagers holding hands awkwardly but sweetly. David was completely absorbed in watching them. Robert realized his son had never seen anything like this before. At home, David watched professional performances on television or attended formal events where everything was choreographed and perfect. This was different, messy, real, and somehow more beautiful. "Mr. Robert." Keisha appeared beside their table again. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but I noticed David really seems interested in the dancing." Robert tensed. Here it came, the pity, the well-meaning suggestions that would make David feel different and limited. But Keisha surprised him. "My daughter loves to dance, but she's too shy to join in alone. Would it be okay if I introduced her to David? Sometimes it's easier to watch together than to watch alone." Before Robert could object, David nodded eagerly. "I'd like that." Keisha waved to a young girl sitting with an elderly woman across the room. The girl was about 8 years old, wearing a simple dress and watching the dancers with the same fascination as David. "That's my daughter Maya," Keisha said. And that's my mom, who's watching her tonight while I work. Maya's been wanting to dance, but she's nervous about going out there by herself. Maya approached their table shyly, staying close to her mother. Maya, this is David, Keisha said. He's been watching the dancers too. Hi, Maya said quietly, then looked at David's wheelchair with curious but not unkind eyes. Does it hurt? Robert started to intervene, but David answered calmly. No, it doesn't hurt. I was born this way. My legs just work differently. Maya nodded like this made perfect sense. My friend at school has glasses because her eyes work differently. She says they help her see better. David smiled, a real smile, not the polite one he used with doctors and therapists. That's a good way to think about it. As Maya and David talked, Robert found himself really looking at Keisha for the first time. She was probably in her late 20s with kind eyes and a warm smile. She worked with quiet efficiency but never seemed rushed or stressed. She treated everyone, from the elderly volunteers to the rowdy teenagers, with the same respect and patience. What struck Robert most was how she interacted with David. She didn't speak to him like he was fragile or different. She didn't use the careful, overly gentle tone that most adults used around disabled children. She talked to him like he was just another person, which Robert realized was exactly what David needed. The slow song continued, and Robert watched as David and Maya chatted easily about school, movies, and their favorite foods. For the first time in years, David was having a normal conversation with someone his own age range, without Robert monitoring every word. Then something happened that Robert wasn't prepared for. The music swelled, and Maya looked wistfully at the dance floor where other families were swaying together. I wish I could dance, she said softly. David looked at the dancers, then back at Maya. Maybe we could figure out a way. Robert's heart stopped. What was David thinking? He couldn't dance, not in the traditional sense. The doctors had always said physical activities like dancing were too risky, too difficult, too likely to result in injury or embarrassment. But as Robert watched his son's face, he saw something he hadn't seen in years. Determination mixed with hope. David wasn't looking at his limitations. He was looking at possibilities. And for the first time since entering the community center, Robert wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong about what his son needed. The slow song was ending, and Robert felt relief wash over him. He had been holding his breath, waiting for the awkward moment when David would realize he couldn't dance like the other kids. But as the music faded, a new song began. Another, slow, gentle melody that seemed to invite everyone onto the dance floor. Maya sighed wistfully as she watched couples and families swaying together. I really want to dance, she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. David was quiet for a moment, studying the dance floor with intense concentration. Robert could see the wheels turning in his son's mind, and it made him nervous. He knew that look. It was the same expression David got when he was solving a difficult math problem or figuring out how to reach something on a high shelf. Maybe we can dance, David said suddenly, his voice stronger than usual. Robert's stomach dropped. David, I don't think, he started, ready to list all the reasons why this was a bad idea. The wheelchair, the other kids watching, the possibility of embarrassment, the risk of David getting hurt emotionally when he realized what he couldn't do. But David looked directly at his father for the first time all evening. Dad, I want to try. There was something in David's voice that Robert had never heard before. Not defiance exactly, but determination. It was the voice of a young man who was tired of being told what he couldn't do and was ready to discover what he could do. Keisha, who had been clearing nearby tables, overheard their conversation. She stopped what she was doing and knelt down beside David's wheelchair, bringing herself to his eye level. Robert tensed, expecting her to either discourage David or offer the kind of pity that would make everything worse. Instead, she smiled. What kind of dancing were you thinking about? David looked uncertain for the first time. I don't know, I've never really danced before, but I can move my arms and I can feel the music. Maybe that's enough? Robert wanted to interrupt, to protect his son from disappointment. But something about Keisha's calm confidence stopped him. She wasn't treating this like an impossible dream or a charity case. She was treating it like a problem they could solve together. "You know what?" Keisha said thoughtfully. "Dancing isn't really about your feet. It's about feeling the music and expressing it with your body. And you have a lot of body to work with, even sitting down." She stood up and looked at the dance floor, then back at David. "Would you like to try something? I promise we'll go slow, and if you don't like it, we can stop any time." David nodded eagerly. Maya clapped her hands together, excited to see what would happen. Robert felt panic rising in his chest. "Wait," he said, standing up quickly. "David has never done anything like this. He could get hurt or embarrassed or—" "Dad?" David's voice was quiet but firm. "I want to try." Those 4 words hit Robert like a physical blow. When had his son ever asked for something this directly? When had David ever expressed a want that wasn't about medical treatments or therapy, or the safe, controlled activities Robert had chosen for him? Keisha looked at Robert with understanding in her eyes. "I have a younger brother with disabilities," she said gently. "I know how scary it can be to watch someone you love try new things, but sometimes the scariest thing is also the most important thing." Before Robert could respond, Keisha was guiding David's wheelchair toward the edge of the dance floor, not into the middle where everyone would stare, but to a spot where they'd have some space and privacy. Other teenagers noticed them moving and began to gather around, but not in the cruel, gawking way Robert had feared. They seemed genuinely curious and supportive. A few even stepped back to give David and Keisha more room. "Okay," Keisha said, kneeling beside David's wheelchair again. "Let's start simple. Can you feel the beat of the music?" David closed his eyes and listened. The song was slow and sweet, with a rhythm that seemed to pulse through the room. After a moment, he nodded and began to move his shoulders slightly in time with the music. "Perfect," Keisha said. "That's exactly right. Now, dancing is really just about sharing that feeling with someone else. Would you like to try dancing with me?" David's eyes opened wide. "You want to dance with me?" "I'd be honored," Keisha said, and Robert could tell she meant it. What happened next was unlike anything Robert had ever seen. Keisha placed her hands gently in David's, and instead of trying to pull him up or make him do something he couldn't, she let him lead. David began to move his arms in slow, graceful motions, following the rhythm of the music. Keisha mirrored, his movements creating a beautiful, synchronized dance that worked perfectly with David's abilities. David's face transformed. The quiet, withdrawn expression he usually wore disappeared, replaced by pure joy. He was completely absorbed in the music and the movement, his whole body expressing the happiness he felt inside. But the magic didn't stop there. Maya, who had been watching in amazement, stepped closer. "Can I dance too?" she asked shyly. "Of course," David said, never breaking the rhythm. "Take my other hand." Soon the 3 of them were moving together. David in his wheelchair, Keisha kneeling beside him, and Maya standing on his other side, all connected by their joined hands and the shared rhythm of the music. Other teenagers began to notice what was happening. Instead of staring or whispering, they started to join in. First 1, then 2, then a small group formed around David, Keisha, and Maya. They weren't making a spectacle of David's differences, they were celebrating what he could. Robert watched in stunned silence as his son became the center of something beautiful. The other kids followed David's lead, creating their own arm movements and gentle swaying motions. Some sat on the floor so they could be at David's level. Others formed a larger circle around the core group. What struck Robert most was how natural it all looked. This wasn't charity or pity, it was genuine inclusion. These kids weren't dancing with David because they felt sorry for him. They were dancing with him because he had created something beautiful that they wanted to be part of. The song seemed to go on forever, and Robert found himself moving closer to get a better view. He pulled out his phone, thinking he should record this moment, but then stopped. This wasn't something to be captured and saved, it was something to be experienced and remembered. David was glowing with happiness in a way Robert had never seen before. His son's face was radiant, his movements confident and graceful. For the first time in his life, David wasn't the disabled kid who needed special accommodations. He was just David, a teenager who could dance beautifully in his own unique way. The song neared its end. David looked around at all the faces surrounding him, teenagers who had accepted him instantly and completely. Then his eyes found his father in the crowd, and David smiled the biggest, most genuine smile Robert had ever seen. In that moment, Robert understood something that changed everything. He had spent 16 years trying to protect David from the world, convinced that people would be cruel or dismissive. But these kids, these wonderful, accepting kids, had done something in 5 minutes that all of Robert's money and protection had never accomplished. They had made David feel normal, valued, and included. Tears filled Robert's eyes as he realized the truth. David didn't need protection from the world. He needed the chance to be part of it. When the music finally ended, the circle of teenagers erupted in genuine applause and cheers. David was breathing hard, his cheeks flushed with excitement and happiness. "That was amazing," one of the kids said. "You're a really good dancer." "Can we do it again with the next song?" another asked. David looked around at all the eager faces, then at Keisha, who was beaming with pride. "Yes," he said, his voice stronger and more confident than Robert had ever heard it. "I'd love to dance again." As the next song began and the circle reformed around his son, Robert finally understood what Dr. Peterson had been trying to tell him. David didn't need a perfect, protected world. He needed this: connection, acceptance, and the chance to discover his own strengths in his own way. Standing at the edge of the dance floor, watching his son lead a group of teenagers in a dance that celebrated ability rather than disability, Robert felt his carefully constructed world shift on its axis. Everything he thought he knew about protecting David crumbled, replaced by a new understanding of what it really meant to help his son thrive. The car ride home was unlike any Robert had ever experienced with his son. David couldn't stop talking. For 16 years, getting more than a few words out of David had been like pulling teeth. Now he was chattering nonstop about the dance, the music, the other kids, and especially about when they could go back. "Dad, did you see how Jake showed me that arm movement? And Lisa said I have natural rhythm." "Natural rhythm, Dad. Can you believe it?" David's eyes were bright with excitement, his hands moving as he tried to recreate some of the dance moves from his wheelchair. Robert nodded and smiled, but inside his mind was spinning. The evening had shattered everything he thought he knew about his son and about the world David lived in. For years, Robert had been so focused on what David couldn't do that he had completely missed what David could do. When they got home, David didn't want to go to his room like usual. Instead, he stayed in the living room, still talking about the dance. He described every detail, how the music felt, how it felt to lead the group, how good it was to make friends who didn't treat him like he was made of glass. "When can we go? Back?" David asked for the third time. "They said there's another event next month. Can we go to that one too?" Robert hesitated. One night at the community center was an experiment. Making it a regular thing felt scary and unpredictable. "We'll see," he said, the same response he gave to most of David's requests. But this time, David didn't accept it quietly like he usually did. "Dad, why do you always say we'll see when you really mean no?" The question hit Robert like a slap. David was right, and they both knew it. "We'll see" was Robert's way of avoiding decisions that made him uncomfortable. It was his way of keeping control while making David think he had a choice. That night, Robert couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the dance, about the way David had come alive in that room full of strangers. He thought about Keisha, the young woman who had seen something in David that Robert had missed. She had treated David like a normal teenager, not like a fragile patient who needed constant protection. The next morning, Robert did something he rarely did. He canceled his morning meetings and spent time online, not working, but researching. He found himself looking up information about the community center, reading about their programs, and trying to understand the world David wanted to be part of. That's when he discovered something that made him uncomfortable. He found Keisha's LinkedIn profile and learned more about her background. She had a college degree in marketing and had worked for several successful companies before losing her job during economic difficulties. Now she was working 3 different part-time jobs, serving at events, cleaning offices at night, and working at a local grocery store during the day. Robert felt confused and a little guilty. He had assumed Keisha was just a server, someone without education or ambition. He had dismissed her because of her job, not realizing that circumstances had forced her into work that was beneath her qualifications. She was a single mother doing whatever it took to support her daughter, and somehow she still had energy left over to be kind to other people's children. The more Robert learned about Keisha, the more uncomfortable he became with his own assumptions. He had judged her based on where she worked instead of who she was. And who she was, he was beginning to realize, was someone with more wisdom about raising children than he had. Days passed, and David kept asking about the community center. He wanted to know when they could go back, whether they could visit during regular programs, if he could see Maya and the other kids again. Each question made Robert more anxious but also more aware of how much that one evening had meant to his son. Finally, Robert made a decision that surprised even him. He called the community center and asked to speak with someone about their programs for teenagers. The woman who answered was friendly and helpful, explaining that they had activities 3 times a week, arts and crafts on Wednesdays, sports and games on Fridays, and social events on Saturdays. "We'd love to have David join us," she said. Keisha mentioned what a wonderful young man he is and how much the other kids enjoyed meeting him. Robert felt a strange mix of pride and uncertainty. Other kids had enjoyed meeting David. His son, who Robert had always worried would be rejected or pitied, had actually been welcomed and liked. That afternoon, Robert did something even more surprising. He drove to the grocery store where Keisha worked, not to shop, but to talk. He found her stocking shelves in the cereal aisle, wearing the store uniform and looking tired but still maintaining the same warm smile he remembered from the dance. "Mr. Robert," she said, clearly surprised to see him. "Is everything okay? Is David all right?" "David is fine," Robert said quickly. "Actually, he's better than fine. He hasn't stopped talking about the other night. I wanted to thank you for what you did." Keisha looked embarrassed. "I didn't do anything special. David's a great kid, he just needed a chance to show it." Robert shifted uncomfortably. He had come here to offer Keisha money, thinking that was what she needed and what would make him feel better about the situation. But now, standing in the grocery store aisle, he realized how insulting that would be. "I've been thinking," Robert said carefully, "about what you said that night, about David needing to be around other kids his age." Keisha nodded. "How's he been since the dance?" "Different," Robert admitted. "Happier, more talkative. He keeps asking when he can see everyone again." "And what do you tell him?" Robert was quiet for a moment. "I tell him we'll see. But you were right the other night. I usually mean no when I say that." Keisha stopped stocking shelves and looked at Robert directly. "Can I ask you something? And please don't take this the wrong way." Robert nodded, though he felt nervous about what she might say. "Why are you so afraid to let David be around other people? He's smart, funny, and kind. Any group would be lucky to have him." The question hung in the air between them. Robert had expected many things from this conversation, but not such a direct challenge to his parenting choices. "You don't understand," Robert said defensively. "David is vulnerable. People can be cruel, especially to kids who are different. I've seen it before." "Have you?" Keisha asked gently. "Or have you been so busy protecting David from imaginary cruelty that you've never given people a chance to show you how kind they can be?" Robert felt anger flare up, then die down just as quickly. Because deep down he knew she was right. He had made assumptions about how the world would treat David without ever testing those assumptions. "I have a daughter," Keisha continued. "She has learning disabilities that make school really hard for her. When she was younger, I was terrified to let her join any activities or make friends. I thought kids would tease her or teachers would give up on her." Robert found himself listening intently. "But you know what I learned? The world is full of good people who want to help, not hurt. Yes, there are some mean people out there, but there are way more kind ones. And by trying to protect Maya from the mean ones, I was also keeping her away from all the good ones. Keisha's words hit Robert harder than any business negotiation or boardroom confrontation ever had. He thought about all the opportunities he had denied David, all the friendships his son might have had, all the joy he had prevented in the name of protection. David told me he's never had friends his own age, Keisha said softly. That breaks my heart, not because I pity him, but because he has so much to offer. Those kids at the dance weren't being nice to David out of charity. They genuinely liked him. He made them feel good about themselves. Robert felt tears threatening. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. I don't know how to let him go out into the world without me controlling everything. Keisha's expression softened with understanding. You don't have to figure it all out at once. Maybe start small. Let him come to one activity at the community center. Stay if you want. See how it goes. As Robert drove home that afternoon, Keisha's words echoed in his mind. He had spent 16 years building walls around David, thinking he was creating safety. But maybe he had actually been creating prison walls, keeping David locked away from the very experiences that would help him grow and thrive. That evening, Robert found David in his room, reading as usual. But instead of sitting quietly, David looked up hopefully when his father entered. Dad, did you think any more about the community center? Robert took a deep breath. How would you feel about joining their Wednesday program? It's arts and crafts, and Keisha said Maya goes to that one. David's face lit up like Christmas morning. Really? You mean it? I mean it, Robert said. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was making the right choice for his son. That night, as Robert lay in bed, he realized that learning to be a better father was going to be just as much about changing himself as it was about changing David's world. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what they both needed. 6 months later, Robert stood at the edge of the community center gymnasium, watching something he never thought he'd see. David was sitting with a group of teenagers, all of them laughing at something Jake had just said. They weren't being careful around David or treating him like he might break. They were just being teenagers together, joking, complaining about homework, and planning their weekend activities. The change in David was remarkable. The quiet, withdrawn boy who used to spend hours alone in his room had been replaced by a confident young man who looked forward to every Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday at the community center. David had friends now, real friends who called him, invited him to movies, and genuinely enjoyed his company. But the biggest change, Robert had to admit, was in himself. That first Wednesday 6 months ago had been terrifying for Robert. He had dropped David off at the arts and crafts program and then sat in his car in the parking lot for 2 hours, convinced something would go wrong. Every few minutes he had been tempted to go inside and check on David to make sure he wasn't being teased or left out. When he finally picked David up, his son had been glowing with excitement. David had made a friendship bracelet for Maya, helped Jake with a painting project, and been invited to join a group discussion about favorite movies. Nothing bad had happened. In fact, everything had been wonderful. The second week, Robert had managed to leave the parking lot and run errands while David was at the program. By the fourth week, he was scheduling business meetings during David's community center time. Now 6 months later, Robert barely worried at all when David was at his activities. Tonight was special. It was the community center's annual spring dance, exactly 6 months after the night that had changed everything. Robert had arrived early to help set up something that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. He had volunteered to help with decorations and had even donated new sound equipment for the music. Mr. Robert. Maya came running up to him, her face bright with excitement. Did you see what David taught us? He made up a new dance and everyone wants to learn it. Robert smiled. Over the past 6 months, he had watched Maya grow too. The shy little girl who had been nervous to dance was now one of the most confident kids at the center. She and David had become close friends, and their friendship had taught Robert a lot about how kids with different abilities could support each other naturally. Show me, Robert said, and Maya immediately began demonstrating a series of arm movements that were graceful and fun, clearly designed to work well for someone sitting down but beautiful for anyone to do. David says dancing is about feeling the music with your whole body, not just your feet, Maya explained as she moved. He's teaching everyone that there are lots of ways to dance. Robert felt his chest tighten with pride. His son had become a teacher, sharing his unique perspective and helping other kids see movement and music in new ways. David wasn't just participating in this community, he was contributing to it in ways that made everyone better. Keisha appeared beside them, carrying a tray of decorations. "Your son is amazing," she said to Robert. "He's helped 3 kids who were too shy to join activities find their confidence. And he's been teaching the older kids to be more patient with the younger ones." Robert nodded, still getting used to hearing people praise David for his character and abilities rather than just being kind about his disabilities. "He loves it here," Robert said. "I think he looks forward to coming here more than anything else in his week." "What about you?" Keisha asked. "How are you feeling about all this?" It was a question Robert had been asking himself a lot lately. 6 months ago, he would have said he was terrified. Now, the answer was more complicated. "I'm still scared sometimes," Robert admitted, "but I'm also proud, and I'm learning that being scared doesn't have to stop David from living his life." Keisha smiled. "That's good wisdom. I'm still learning that lesson myself." Over the past 6 months, Robert and Keisha had developed an unexpected friendship. She had become his guide to understanding David's new world, helping him navigate the fears and challenges of letting his son become more independent. In return, Robert had quietly helped fund several community center programs, including a scholarship fund that helped families like Keisha's access activities they couldn't otherwise afford. The relationship had been a learning experience for Robert. He had discovered that respect and friendship couldn't be bought with money. Keisha had made it clear that she valued his support for the community center, but their friendship was based on mutual respect and shared experiences as parents, not on his wealth. "I need to tell you something," Robert said to Keisha as they finished hanging decorations. 6 months ago, I thought I was protecting David by keeping him away from places like this. I thought the world would be cruel to him." Keisha nodded, encouraging him to continue. "But the truth is, I was the one being cruel. I was so afraid of what might happen that I prevented him from discovering what could happen. I kept him from finding out how strong and capable and likable he really is." "You were being a scared parent," Keisha said gently. "That's not the same as being cruel. You just needed to learn a different way to love him." As if summoned by their conversation, David rolled up to them in his wheelchair, his face flushed, with excitement from helping set up chairs with his friends. "Dad, are you going to dance tonight?" David asked. "Jake's mom is going to dance, and Maya's grandma said she might try a slow song." Robert laughed. "I'm not much of a dancer, son." "That's what I thought too," David said with a grin. "But it turns out dancing isn't about being good at it. It's about having fun and being with people you care about." As the evening began and families started arriving, Robert found himself thinking about how much his definition of success had changed. 6 months ago, success meant protecting David from any possible discomfort or challenge. Now, success meant watching David navigate challenges on his own and grow stronger from the experience. The music started, and Robert watched as David immediately became the center of a group of teenagers who were eager to try his new dance moves. But this time, Robert didn't feel nervous or protective. He felt proud. "Dad, come dance with us," David called out, waving, his father over to join the group. Robert hesitated for a moment, then made his way onto the dance floor. As he joined the circle of teenagers, following David's lead and trying to keep up with the arm movements his son had created, Robert realized something important. He had spent 16 years trying to build a perfect world for David. But David didn't need a perfect world. He needed a real world, one with challenges and opportunities, failures and successes, heartbreak and joy. Most importantly, he needed the chance to discover his own place in that world. As the music played and the teenagers laughed and danced together, Robert saw David catch the eye of a girl his own age across the circle. She smiled at David, and he smiled back, not the careful smile of someone who was grateful for attention, but the confident smile of a young man who knew he had something to offer. Later that evening, Robert watched as David said goodbye to his friends, making plans for the following week and exchanging phone numbers with the girl who had smiled at him. His son was growing up, becoming independent, making his own choices and his own relationships. "Thank you," Robert said to Keisha as they cleaned up after the dance. "For what?" "For seeing David for who he really is. For helping me see him that way too." Keisha smiled. David did that himself, he just needed the chance. As they drove home that night, David talked excitedly about the evening, about the dancing, his friends, and especially about the girl who had asked for his phone number. Robert listened with genuine interest, no longer worried about protecting David from the complexities of teenage life, but excited to see how his son would navigate them. "Dad," David said as they pulled into their driveway, "I know I've said this before, but thank you for letting me join the community center. It's changed everything for me." Robert turned to look at his son, really look at him. David's eyes were bright with confidence and happiness. His posture was straight and proud. He looked like a young man who knew his own worth and was ready to take on the world. "You changed everything for me too, son," Robert said. "You taught me that love isn't about protecting someone from the world. It's about helping them find their place in it." As they went inside their house, a house that no longer felt like a beautiful prison but like a home where a confident young man happened to live, Robert realized that his greatest achievement wasn't building a business empire or accumulating wealth. His greatest achievement was learning to be the father David deserved and watching David become the remarkable young man he was always meant to be.